Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Amongst the many rules of adventuring in D&D is never trust a treasure chest in the dungeon. For who knows if when you lay your hands upon that chest, it suddenly transforms into a sticky, gooey creature and a mouth erupts out of it as it opens up and devours whoever would try to seize the treasure within. That's the Mimic, one of the most loved and despised monsters in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons.
Mimics are creatures that can adapt their form into standard objects, so no matter where you are adventuring, you're never safe from a mimic. Mimics are iconically depicted as treasure chests who open up with horrible mouths, although mimics can be any mundane object that you find anywhere in a dungeon, so you can never trust your doors, your windows, your chairs, your rugs. There's no limit to what a mimic might be and the ways that they might surprise and devour you.
Mimics are often used as a fire and forget trap type monster, something to annoy or surprise the player characters, but not necessarily something that we think of with the same detail that we might say a dragon or even a goblin. But that's missing so much of the potential of what mimics can offer when we want to use them in our stories and also use them in a more nuanced way in combat encounters. So today we're going to look at what mimics do, how to use them in our games, how to get more out of them, and how to even build adventures around mimics. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
So to get started, the Mimic is a challenge rating 2 monster that is most notable for its ability to pose as any object. When we actually get into how we might play a mimic at the table, we want to think about more than just making it a random trap. Your adventure party goes to open up the treasure chest, and oh no, it's a mimic, which still might surprise them, but a lot of adventurers now see this coming.
A lot of adventurers are super paranoid because there are so many things in D&D that look like one thing and transform into something that tries to eat you. So it's not uncommon to see adventurers carrying around things like 10-foot poles or sacrificial minions, or otherwise to have them do the poking and the prodding to make sure that the characters aren't the ones getting eaten by the treasure chest. And so we're going to talk about the ways that you can still surprise your players by having mimics posed as objects that they might not be expecting. But it's worth thinking about the how and the why and the what of the mimic. Because so often a mimic is one of those creatures that is often used as part of a trap in a dungeon, and oftentimes we don't put necessarily the thought that we should into why this creature is here, how it got there, and what it's doing. A mimic is not a particularly intelligent monster, so it is a predator that wants to devour and eat its prey. And if we look to the real world, there are real world examples of predators that use this type of tactic. One of my favorite examples is the spider-tailed horned viper. As you might assume from the snake's name, the snake's tail from a distance kinda looks like a spider, and the snake is known for hiding under a rock but exposing just its tail. It wiggles its tail a little, and a bird sees what they think is a tasty bug to eat. The bird swoops down, and it ends up as dinner instead because the snake pops out and devours it.
If you're anything like me and you love watching animal documentaries and nature shows, then you have seen this countless times. There are so many animals in nature that lure prey towards them as by mimicking themselves as something else. I think that one of the most terrifying creatures of the sea is the anglerfish, which has that light bulb attached to its head, which it uses to lure little fish towards it. Oh, what's this light? Well, you're about to get devoured by the scariest looking fish ever seen. So I think that we can look to these nature shows and documentaries to really think about what it means to be a predator who can hide in plain sight, lure its prey towards it, and then strike at the right moment. Mimics aren't generally just sitting around doing nothing. There's an intention behind why they are where they are and what they've chosen to pose as. So when you're thinking about your mimic, think about the environment that they're in and what it is that they might be hunting. Are they hunting people? Well, now a chair or a door or a treasure chest is the perfect thing to mimic as. But maybe there's other creatures in the environment that there are more likely to be attracted towards a different type of object. So depending on the environment, your mimic might take a very different form as it's hunting the prey around it.
Another important takeaway from this idea of mimics as predators is that predators go where the food is. So a mimic in a long-lost dungeon that has never been opened in forever is either going to be starved and crazy and maybe dead, or maybe mimics are going to gravitate towards places where there are more people. Mimics in a city or an urban environment could be a terrifying urban scourge, masquerading in alleyways as maybe a garbage can or a discarded bottle, or perhaps even just a bag of coins that someone thinks, oh, I'll pick this up off the street. And then all of a sudden they are devoured by a mimic. So I actually think that unlike being a dungeon predator, maybe a mimic makes sense in a mega dungeon. But I actually think that mimics could be a really interesting urban scourge in this respect.
I think that mimics get much scarier when you actually put them in environments that are well populated. You suddenly have an entire murder mystery opening up of like, why are people going missing? Nobody can find any trace of them, and there's no murder weapon. Who's the killer? Well, it's the random objects around the alleyways that are actually killing people. So when we start to think of mimics as more than just a trap and as really smart predators, again, they're not the most intelligent creatures. But no matter how limited the intelligence of a creature is, remember that all animals in the wild know how to hunt, know how to get food, and know how to generally stay safe from their predators. Mimics are no different, and they're actually really, really good at this.
Like any predator, mimics might be nocturnal, and they might lie dormant all day and only strike at night. Perhaps a mimic is posing as a mug in a tavern and uses its adherence ability to fall into the backpack of a tavern patron after last call and go home with them. Perhaps one mimic inhabits a city library and waits until someone takes it home as a book. Perhaps another mimic just likes to live in marketplaces and fits itself in with any common items found in a marketplace until it's bought and waits to transform into its true form until it's taken home. Mimics are smart enough to do this kind of behavior, and in this we get the seeds of some really cool adventures and some really cool scenarios where the player characters can solve, why are these bizarre murders happening? Now, of course, we could also always justify a mimic as the creation of a mad wizard, or perhaps some sort of far realm influence is warping the environment and causing objects to become mimics. But once we start thinking about these things, we can see much more creative applications for where mimics might appear.
Another really interesting question that you can ask yourself is, what does a mimic actually look like? Again, we could go the route of it being an infection that attaches itself to mundane objects and turns them into living creatures. But if that's not the way we're going, and there is a mimic creature that changes itself into other forms, does it have a natural form? It's a really interesting question, and I do think that we can look to even like movies like The Thing, or like those sort of Cronenberg type monsters.
I imagine a mimic's natural form kind of being like the symbiote of Venom. It's kind of like an amorphous blob of just plasma or like material matter in an amorphous sort of shape, and that when it takes on its form to devour someone, or because like when you see mimics in the art of 5th edition, they often have these very specific types of teeth and these very specific types of eyes that they manifest, and there's kind of like this purple sinew that is bursting out from within whatever the object is. So I do like this idea that that is the telltale sign of a mimic, that there is some sort of underlying creature, but it, like a chameleon almost, it always takes in part of the form that it last took. One of the things that I also think of is the T-1000 from the Terminator movies.
Right.
And when it was towards the end of Terminator 2, when it's damaged, whatever object it grabs onto, it does that chameleon thing where it kind of becomes the steel girders, or it becomes the pipe. And that's just how the mimic operates.
I think that when we move into the combat tactics for a mimic, we are going to go a little traditional at first here, but now that we have this roleplay inspiration, we can really drive home the fact that the mimic is a predator that waits and lunges and surprises their foes when they're least expecting. So depending on the object you've chosen for your mimic, the mimic is going to place itself in an environment, in a location that it wants to be approached and touched. Oftentimes, it's not going to hide itself under blankets in the corner of the room where nobody's going to find it. It's probably going to be the chair in the middle of the room, the head seat at a dining table, or the bowl of delicious food set out at the table, or possibly the rug that when you first walk in, you're going to step on it. It wants to lure prey to it. It's going to wait for the opportune moment, and you always get to do that wonderful thing that mimics do, where they actually are a very sticky creature.
Yeah.
And so the first time that a player realizes what they're in for is when they've grabbed an object, stepped somewhere they shouldn't, touched something, and it gets stuck to them.
Now, because mimics are predators, one thing that we could think about is a lot of times predators will stay and hide if they're outnumbered. So a mimic might wait for that opportunity to strike when it can catch its prey alone, or it can catch wounded prey or prey that are vulnerable in some other way. And this is one way to do great misdirection with a mimic, because if the mimic doesn't attack the first one that touches it, if it waits for the good opportunity, then it can be much more effective. If it allows itself to be picked up as a chest that the players can't figure out how to open, and then they bring it back into their encampment, and then that night it strikes, that's something way scarier than if it just popped out right away and latched onto one party member but then got destroyed by the others. By a similar token, maybe mimics aren't solo hunters. Maybe mimics are pack hunters.
I think that that's a really cool concept, and oftentimes we found that mimics get used as solo creatures. But I think having the dining room table where all the chairs are mimics is much scarier, and it waits for the players to all sit down to enjoy the lovely feast, then the chairs attack.
In this respect, the various different objects could all be mimics. Perhaps maybe even the mimics all work together, and only the chair at the head of the table is a mimic, but so is the plate, so is the fork, so is the knife, so is the goblet. And whoever sits at the head of the table gets attacked by 5 mimics. We could imagine mimics even taking smaller or larger forms, and there's some great variants that have been introduced in D&D 5e, such as spitting mimics, horde mimics, juvenile mimics, giant mimics, that let us have mimics of varying sizes. A mimic could be as small as a single coin, or it could be as large as an entire house. Now, we could also imagine that maybe mimics work with other creatures in very rare cases. Just like human beings have tamed predators like wolves to be dogs, what if doppelgangers kept tamed mimics as their hunting companions? Or what if an oblex teamed up with a group of mimics, and so the oblex and the doppelgangers impersonate people while the mimics impersonate objects?
You could have an entire dungeon of just things posing as other things by using the right creatures.
Well, that's where you get into the far realm corruption of, like, what if the dungeon itself is a creature and the mimics are its children? And I think that when we add more creatures into the combat, there's this opportunity that in a combat encounter where the players are interacting with the environment, for example, in a combat where there's doors separating different rooms, or a combat where there's levers that need to be pulled, or a puzzle the players get to solve, some of the elements could be mimics. And then the players risk, hey, you're in the middle of a fight with another monster, but then the mimic could join in at the same time. And this works either when the mimics are actively working with the monsters or as an opportunist, because it might be that a mimic simply is an opportunist in a larger dungeon and just hides and waits for the straggler, right?
I'm also thinking it might be brilliant that a mimic wants to split the party. So a mimic posing as a door lets the first person open the door, walk through, and it closes. The next person grabs the doorknob, and then the door tries to eat them. Now you're kind of splitting the party. There's a lot of really fun tactics that a mimic could wait for other creatures to start attacking. Depending on where you pose them or where you put them, there's so many options for creative ways to use mimics.
Now, normal mimics don't speak, but it is suggested in the monster manual that maybe they could talk or have some form of telepathy. That would give them another way of luring people in as well, which because when the mimic also poses as a magic item, that's when you get something really weird. And like if the mimic is telepathic or can talk, and it takes the form of a sword, and it claims to be a magic sword, that's just like shining the spider even more brightly for the bird.
I think that there's a lot of fun you can have with telepathy. Voices in your players' heads that are saying like, going back to the dining room table, I've prepared this lovely feast for you. Please sit down. And you're like, who's saying that? And if they decide to sit down, oops. But I think that also if we are giving a mimic telepathy, having it pose as a magic sword, I think what's really cool is if you give the mimic maybe a spell or a spell casting trait or an ability to use a spell-like ability.
Or some sort of spell mimicry ability itself,
Yeah, like if it's posing as a flame tongue, maybe this mimic does fire damage additionally when it attacks. You know, there's different ways that we could imagine implementing higher level mimics by giving it spell mimicry or the ability to pose as a magic item and adapt those powers into itself.
You know, the other fun thing is I like to also think of creatures from nature like crabs that pick up a shell. And so in this respect, you could have a mimic that is one part of a two-part object. So what if the mimic isn't the bottle, but the cork? And so most people handle the bottle by the bottle itself, and it's not until you go to open the bottle that you actually touch the cork.
It might be tempting to have your mimic turn into a person. Although I think that's a compelling idea that we probably could use, I do think that there's other creatures that we've mentioned, like doppelgangers or the obelix, that really lend themselves to that avenue. So I think sharing the environment with other mimicking creatures is a better fit than having a mimic be a person. We could also throw into our dungeon of mimicry many other animated objects or creatures that pose as other things. I think, for example, rugs of smothering, animated armor, there's animated weapons. You even have ropers, which pose as rocks. You have gargoyles that pose as statues. Golems, same idea. You could fill an entire environment with just these types of creatures where everything is trying to kill the party.
I think your players are going to hate you if you do this. You're going to have a ball as a DM, but I think your players are going to hate you after this dungeon.
What's great about this dungeon, though, is at the beginning, they're just going to be like, oh my god, the rug's killing me, the armor's killing me, the chair's killing me, the person who was the friendly barkeep is killing me. By the end of the adventure, they're walking into every room, poking the door, they're like, oh my god, and like, it will instill paranoia into your players, and it sounds really fun.
So in terms of adventure ideas, I think we've already touched on a few, but I think that the first one of the two that we could really expand into a full concept is the mimics as the serial killer. I really like this adventure idea that mimics infesting an urban environment, people are disappearing, and it's not a human, it's a mimic. And maybe the mimics have like a sewer lair. They are a pack of mimics. They're working together or something, or like a super mimic or something like that. But that it turns out that this is being caused by mimics. And maybe you could even have a villain behind it. Like maybe there actually is a doppelganger who has trained the mimics and is helping plant the mimics to attack their victims. This is like a super magic high fantasy like detective story, and I'm into it.
Yeah. I think that another really awesome idea that we could do is we've talked about, you mentioned the dungeon is alive and the mimic is its children. But I also think if we stretch that even further and we actually combine that with the urban environment, what if there's just a house that appears on a street in a town and nobody saw this house before? The house is a mimic. The objects inside are mimics. It is filled with people, an obelix. And it just appears one day, and people who are passing by see like the new inn that just sprung out of nowhere. And there's a person in the front being like, come on in, it's really cheap to stay here. First night's free. Lures people in, and then everything inside of this magic house eats up the people that are staying there, and then the house disappears overnight and moves to a new location.
I like to imagine, too, that the house waits until midnight. Like, it waits until the rowdy crew is there, everyone's having fun, everything seems great, all the people seem nice. And then, of course, the next time it appears, it uses the people it devoured as the template for the next time.
I also think this mimic house might even wait like a week without eating, because it appears in a town and the townsfolk are like, where did this house come from? Somebody goes to check it out. That's just a regular house. The next time they go, there's a person there. Yeah, I work here. This is my inn. And although it seems really curious and confusing, there's nothing bad happens. And they build that rapport with the town until it fills with people. And then it attacks and vanishes.
What if this inn follows the adventurers? And it knows that it follows behind the adventurers? So it never goes after adventurers. But it knows that adventurers tend to attract an interesting crowd because they tell stories. So again, it's like one of those parasitic predators that it's like the curious inn, the curious house, it never eats the adventurers. But it sets itself up wherever adventurers go, and it eats the common folk that like come to the tavern to like get help from the adventurers or something.
There's a lot of fun with the mimic house idea. I think that even if we're thinking much smaller scale, not really an adventure idea, but just like the encounter idea. I think that what's great is if the players are looking for something, the MacGuffin, or they need to like press a switch or flip a switch. But when they finally enter the room where the switch is or where the MacGuffin is, there's like 8 of them. And you're just like, oh, what do I do? And I just love that setup. I even, I don't tell my players this. I hope none of my players are watching this video. But I'm thinking of using this idea where the player characters are tracking down a dead body. It's somebody died out on an adventure and their family wants them to bring the body back. When they find the body, they find 2 of it. It's like an exact replica of the same body. One of them's a mimic, one of them's the actual body. And the mimic's just like, I'm going to pose as this dead body who has like a bag of treasure on him and like a magic sword. And is just hoping that the adventurers touch him and not the...
That's an interesting thing too, is like, what does a mimic actually eat? Right? Because maybe a mimic, it poses as the treasure by a dead body. And so its last victim, it like eats part of the victim and then is just replaces one of the objects on the victim's body and waits for its next prey.
I think that mimics are super fun and we can be so much more creative than just using the mimic as a basic trap monster. I think that if we think about the way that it hunts, what its goals are, and what its prey is, and think of ways that we can implement adventures and new tactics to really bring mimics to life, I think that we can have so much more fun with this iconic D&D monster. So this has been a look at mimics in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you've used mimics in a creative way in your campaigns, tell us about it in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible support of our Patreon community. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube and want to hop on and chat with us on our patron-only Discord server, follow the links in the description below to get set up.
And make sure to check out our live play, The Fate of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more guides for Dungeon Masters on running monsters in D&D 5e right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.